Okay, welcome tonight. This is Nigel Hicks here, professional photographer in Southwest England. Welcome to my talk this evening. It's about long exposure photography, that is taking photos with the shutter open for long periods of time, mainly when light levels are low, but also during a bright daytime as well. So techniques for how to do this, and it's often for blurring movements or obviously on occasions when there is simply not enough light to actually use a fast shutter speed. So of course, the latter starts off in complete at nighttime, such as this intro image here of the Northern Lights. Obviously, it's taken completely in the dark or at night. It looks like it's taken in the middle of the day, but that's because there was such a bright moon shining that the landscape was lit up quite well. And despite there being such a bright moon, the Northern Lights were still fantastically strong and came over very clearly like this. So we start first of all into talking about long exposures with complete darkness, nighttime, and photography of the night sky, and a shot of the Milky Way taken from Land's End at the far southwestern tip of Cornwall, of course. And of course, this place like Land's End, there's really very little, if any, light pollution, so you really can get some fantastic views of the night sky. But how on earth do you get enough light to actually get a correct exposure? Well, the answer, of course, to get exposure like this, where the stars are pinpoints, is you have a high ISO, in this case 5,000, which is pretty high in my book, and an exposure time of 25 seconds. That's with the lens aperture open to f4, which is the widest it will go on my camera, my lenses. And you end up with a shot of the Milky Way like this. This is actually a composite of several images merged together in software to actually enhance the appearance of the stars and especially the Milky Way. So this is a fairly specialized kind of image, but you can do something pretty similar with just a single shot. The orange light you can see at the bottom of the Milky Way is actually lightning under a storm off over the Atlantic. Just happened to be right below the Milky Way, so it's quite a nice bit of serendipity there. The two lights on the left on the horizon, they're ships. Bright light on the right on the horizon, that's the Wolf Rock Lighthouse. So anyway, obviously one of the problems with this kind of shot with high ISO 5,000 and a long exposure is digital noise, so the picture becomes very grainy. And if you look down in the shadow areas of the cliffs, you can see it is quite grainy. But correct use or good use of software in the computer afterwards can help to reduce that quite considerably, but it doesn't get rid of it altogether. But this is kind of where we're at, I think, with night sky photography. Is actually working reasonably well. Even with a high ISO and a long exposure picture. And then continuing with the night sky kind of photography, this is a very different shot. This is with just a 100 ISO, with the camera looking up towards the pole star, which is up here, and showing the stars rotating around the pole star. And this is a 28-minute exposure. So you can see that each star has moved this sort of distance in the 28 meters, rotating, so I'm going the wrong way, rotating anti-clockwise around the pole star. And I like this picture technically in terms of photography of the pole star and stars rotating around it. This is actually a complete disaster, this picture, because you've got so much light coming from light pollution. This is actually the reason this has happened because it was a very foggy evening, fog coming in over the water here at the mouth of the River Otter near Budleigh Salterton on the south or east coast of Devon. And the fog is diffusing all the light pollution from nearby Budleigh and spreading it across the scene. So it ended up with something quite spectacular. I actually quite like it as an image with an effect. As a sort of a technical success, it's a bit of a disaster, but as a sort of a very atmospheric and moody image, I rather like it. So this kind of shot you take with a very low ISO, say 100, and then you just expose for a very long time. This is actually a single shot, 28 minutes. You can also do it, as with the previous image, with very short exposure times and a high ISO, and just take maybe 100 images and then merge them together in the computer afterwards, and that will give you pretty much the same sort of effect. I opted on this occasion for the single image. 28 minutes is an awfully long exposure, but you're going to end up taking pretty much the same amount of time if you take maybe 50 or 100 images at high ISO, and then stitch them together in the computer afterwards. It's also a long, slow process. And then also nighttime in the city, obviously a great time for doing this kind of shot moving traffic. This was exposure. Let me have a look. This is 13 seconds. So it's 13 seconds off to be able to capture the tail lights of traffic moving around a roundabout in the middle of Shanghai. Camera, obviously, with all these pictures, is on a tripod, and we capture a great sense of movement and a lot of color. It's quite a vibrant sort of image. So this is a great thing for urban sort of photography. A lot of the photography I do, though, which is long exposure, is not actually completely in darkness like this. It's more in the dusk or sort of middle of the evening. This is as it's getting, as after the sun has gone down and as it's getting dark. This is a shot of the old harbour at Weymouth. It's not quite dark. You can see still see clouds in the sky. It's a little bit darker than I would have liked. I would have liked a little bit more light in the sky than this. I got stuck in traffic when I was on my way to this location. I unfortunately got there just right at the end of it all, but I got there just in time to get a reasonable picture. And hopefully you'll agree that this works quite well, quite atmospheric. It has water, but the water is stationary. So even though it's a fairly long exposure, actually, what is it, 4 seconds? So not so long. It's enough to actually capture the right exposure, but not so long that we get movement in the water. It's pretty static. And you can see that one of the problems with photographing a harbour in the evening is that boats tend to move around when you've got a long exposure, so they can come out quite blurred. But these boats are quite sharp, so not too long in exposure. The boats are well moored, well tied up, so they're not moving around at all. So they're nice and sharp and work quite reasonably well. What I usually prefer is this kind of shot, rather more light in the dusk sky. This is actually 8 seconds at f5 and ISO of 200. So I've got lots of light in the sky here. This is the harbour at Porter's Head near Bristol, and it's I like this kind of atmospheric shot where you've got where the sky is bright enough to actually make all the buildings quite clearly visible, and but the buildings nevertheless are lit up by all the man-made lighting as well. So the outlines of the buildings are clearly visible against the sky, and then there's lots of lighting from the man-made light. Again, you've got water, which is static, nice and still on this calm, still evening. And the boats are nicely and firmly moored. So even though it's an 8 second exposure, they're really pretty sharp. There's no movement there that you can see. And it's all worked out quite well. So it's like 8 seconds with f/5. So the lens aperture is quite wide open, 200 ISO. So I didn't really want to go to a really long exposure. I could have kept it at ISO 100 or maybe shut the aperture down a bit more to f8 or f11, but then the exposure would have been up around about 20 seconds, and I think I probably would have then got movement in the boats, and the boats would have been a little bit blurred. And then just looking into the light at dusk, you end up with this kind of nice, beautiful atmospheric silhouette on a very calm, quiet evening. Again, we've got water, which is pretty much stationary, but it is the sea, so there is some movement. Certainly out beyond these rocks and cliffs, there's some movement out there, but essentially the water is stationary, and with the light in the sky just after sunset, everything in the landscape is in a nice silhouette, and that very sort of sense of calm and peace and quiet. And I always find this a very moody atmosphere, and it gives a real nice calming feeling for me anyway. Sometimes, however, when you've got some wind present, you end up with this kind of thing where you have a landscape which may or may not be fairly calm, but then you have scudding clouds which kind of upset the mood a little bit and add a little bit of a little bit of energy, a little bit of movement, a little bit of dynamism, perhaps. It also is a little bit conflicting with the stillness of the landscape, perhaps. So there's a little bit of conflict going on here, I think, in this picture, and I'm not sure whether I'm happy about it or not, but this is the kind of thing you need to watch out for when you're doing long exposure photography, is that things that are moving in a picture, especially clouds, can end up sort of disrupting what might otherwise be quite a calm scene, and put in a sense of energy and movement, often quite good, but here it can actually be a little bit conflicting, with a little bit of too much strife in the shot. The exposure here is 6 seconds, ISO 100, f4.5, so I've got the lens aperture really wide open, which is unusual for me, but I've done it here because I think I probably was attempting to prevent any blur in the clouds, in the moving clouds, but obviously I've failed there, but it's still an interesting shot. might have been better if I'd just gone with it and just completely blurred the clouds and really closed the lens aperture down to f11 or something, had a really long exposure, so the clouds had a really nice strong blur to them. Might have been more effective then. This shot, by the way, shows the volcano Mount Mayon towering over the city of Legazpi in the Philippines. This is the Philippines' most active volcano in terms of the regularity of its eruptions, but fortunately not in terms of its severity. So it's a beautiful silhouette. I love it, but it's just a little bit of conflict here with this nice stationary and peaceful silhouette against this rather conflicting feeling of these moving clouds. And then moving on to still dusk, a little bit lighter perhaps, looking towards the northwestern sky. The sky is quite bright, but nevertheless it's pink. It's taken well after sunset. And we're using quite a long exposure. This is 10 seconds. It's at ISO 100 f14, so the lens actually closed down a fair bit. So there's actually still quite a bit of light there. 10 seconds is completely blurred out the moving water. You can see there are waves, but they're completely blurred out into this beautiful sort of silken sheet where you've got kind of a gossamer, like gossamer film, gossamer veil over the pebbles along the shoreline. And you can see that, that there must be waves coming up and down the beach because a lot of these stones here are partially visible. So they're partially, sometimes out of the water and sometimes in the water. So which is why in that 10 seconds, some of them are visible and they get less and less visible as you get into slightly deeper water. And of course, the composition is very simple. This is the line of stakes to actually, which would originally have been something that protected the seashore, I'm sure. It doesn't do much anymore, but just other than forming a nice little composition in the photography. But 10 seconds, f14, nice image taken at dusk in sort of the middle of the dusk, probably about half an hour or so, 20 minutes perhaps after sunset. Beautiful clear sky with a nice bit of pink and purple in the sky there. Contrast this with this sort of day, very cloudy, very dull, flat skies. It's all a little bit grey, everything's a bit grey. And this is taken about a quarter of an hour or so before sunset, so the sun is still above the horizon. You can't see the sun, of course, but because it's behind this thick grey cloud. But you can still get quite an interesting photograph. This exposure is 1.6 seconds at f22. So I've got the lens aperture closed right down, so everything is sharp all the way from this rock in the foreground all the way to the island in the distance, which is this is Burr Island on the south coast of Devon. And so 1.6 seconds, it still gives us a sense of waves rolling around this rock. You can still see the flow, the movement of the flow. But it's enough to blur the movement to give us a sense of energy and movement, but not so much that we can't anymore see the waves moving around this rock. Contrast this with this picture taken about half an hour or 40 minutes later. It's about half an hour after sunset, and we've got a much longer exposure. So now 6 seconds at f18. So I've opened up the lens aperture a bit, so the exposure time is not too long. But this is 6 seconds, and now you see the water is almost completely blurred out. In the foreground, you've still got the sense of water moving, bit of a wave there, but water streaming around the rock. But everything else is really quite misty and nice sort of silken sheet, you might say, over the whole of the sea. And you also, of course, notice that it's gone very blue. That's because there is now no direct light coming from the sun. The previous picture, it was still some direct light, even though it's filtering through the clouds, and so there was a lot of red light present. And we're getting normal colors. Now the picture is very blue because the only light shining, or the only light illuminating this scene is indirect light coming from the sunlight light's being bounced around by the clouds and by particles in the air, and that light is almost entirely blue. There's almost no red left in the light, so the whole scene becomes quite blue. And the water is completely blurred out. So very, very different shot from the previous one, but very atmospheric, despite the presence of the clouds. So just because you've got a very cloudy evening doesn't mean to say you can't produce great photography with this kind of moving water image. I should say, actually, was hoping that when I was putting this talk together, I was intending to have not just a lot of water photography, but I ended up having to surrender to that because that's mostly what I've been photographing, and that's most of what this long exposure photography consists of. Really, is trying to blur moving water if either that or just shooting in very low light levels to try and get an exposure in the low light. But anyway, that's the end sort of shooting in dusk and nighttime. What about shooting in daylight? Well, first of all, there's daylight when light levels are quite low, and when it's a very cloudy day, the light and there's no sunlight and it's quite dim, and perhaps you're under, as in this case, under a lot of trees. So the light is very strongly filtered, so the light levels are very low, so you can get a long enough exposure. In fact, you need a longish exposure in order to get a picture. So this image, daytime, obviously, and it's f16, and I've done f16 for two reasons. Firstly, I've got a 4-second exposure, which means I'm actually blurring out the movement of this water over here on the right hand side. And that's actually kind of a secondary thing, because most of the water you can see in the picture here and right in the foreground here is pretty static. So that's kind of only very much a secondary feature of this image. The most important thing about this image, about using a very narrow lens aperture for this image, is I've got a huge depth of field. That is, almost the entire picture is sharp, all the way from these rocks in the foreground all the way through to the trees in the background. Everything is sharp, so you go all the way through these rocks to this tree back here, and it's all sharp. And that's the result of using, firstly, a wide angle lens, and secondly, the f16 narrow lens aperture. And that's possible because, well, with the camera on a tripod, of course giving me 4 seconds, and because light levels are low, I to do that. Next sort of shot, very dim light on a very snowy day in Somerset, under a canopy of snow-covered trees. This is actually not such a slow exposure, as you can probably guess from that moving car. It's 0.8 of a second at f22, so the light level is not too bad, but I've deliberately used got a lens aperture very narrow, firstly to give me a big depth of field again, so everything from these trees in the foreground all the way to the background is sharp, but also to be able to blur the movement of this car. 0.8 of a second is enough to actually give me a good blur of the tail lights of this car going past me, coming up towards this bend. And that's kind of obviously finally a non-water movement shot, but giving us a nice sort of blur. But 0.8 of a second is not really that slow, but because the car is moving so fast, it's giving us a really good blur. And then we go back to moving water again. In this instance, the moving water is very much the subject of the image. In that previous woodland shot, the water was important in the shot, but not the movement of it, just the sort of general context of water in the landscape. Here, of course, water is very much the main part of the scene. We've got a strong diagonal here leading us through the chaos of the woodland, giving us a strong sort of theme and an avenue to lead the eye through the picture, through the tangle of the woodland. Now this is a 2-second exposure at f upon 16, so not a very slow exposure, but slow enough to blur this quite fast moving water, and f16 to give me a big depth of field all the way through from the foreground through to the background as well. So in this instance, the water is the main element, or the moving water is the main element in the picture. The woodland is kind of secondary, but obviously it's all part of the scene. In this next image, by contrast, it's the other way around. The tree is very much the central feature of the image, and the water behind is just a backdrop, and I've blurred it out in order to actually make sure it becomes a very simple backdrop with no complications, no distractions, and no elements that compete with all these leaves for the viewer's attention. So the background just becomes a very simple backdrop of blurred moving water. And it's only 1 second, so it's f16 again, so quite a good depth of field with all these leaves nice and sharp. So it's big depth of field to say. It's very still day, no wind at all. Obviously, slightest of breeze would have made these leaves flutter, and it would have been a bit of a mess of the picture. But big depth of field to actually get all this lot sharp, but then the water behind is blurred because of the movement. At 1 second, the water's moving pretty fast. At 1 second is slow enough to give us a good movement, a good blur in that water, and make sure it's sort of not distracting us from the main scene of these autumnal leaves. And then finally, in this section, a waterfall. Always going to be a waterfall in my slideshows. And this is a picture of Uolma Falls in the far north of Sweden. This water is moving at an incredible speed, so to blur it out, I don't actually need a very slow exposure time. This is 1.3 seconds at f22, so uh, not really that long in exposure time, but because the water is moving so fast, the water is completely blurred out into this really rather attractive veil, come sheet, silky sheet, whatever you want to call it. And because it's diagonal across the view, it's very energetic, very dynamic. And also because it's part of the picture is quite brightly lit. It wasn't a sunny day, but it was quite a bright light on some of the water. A lot of the scene, as you can see, is in deep shadow. So you've got practically a monochromatic image, almost, not entirely, almost a monochromatic image where the water is almost burned out, but not quite. And we've got this fantastic blur thanks to the 1.3 second exposure. Now, we're going to move on and talk about a little bit of technical stuff and talk about filters. The images I've shown you so far, some of them show no sky, but some of them did show some sky. And usually, anybody who's been on my workshops, I think most of you have, you'll know that when I talk about sky versus landscape, the contrast range between the sky and the landscape is usually too great for the digital sensor to handle. The human eye can handle it without any problem, but the digital sensor just can't, and there's too big a contrast range. So you end up with either the sky correctly exposed and your landscape too dark, or the landscape correctly exposed and the landscape and the sky completely way too bright, burned out, and not showing any features in the sky, cloud features or whatever. To overcome that, you use these filters, neutral density graduated filters, or ND grads. You see two types here: hard ND grad, there's a strong and sharp transition from dark to clear, and here a gradual or soft ND grad, which is a gradual transition from dark to clear. And they're always rectangular. You can buy circular ones, but don't bother with those. Rectangular ones which fit in a holder like this, and that holder then fits onto the front of your lens using an adapter ring that has a thread size which is the same as the front of your lens. And you can slide the filter up and down, hence the rectangular shape. Slide the filter up and down so that the transition zone from dark to clear lines up with whatever kind of horizon you may have in the picture. Obviously, it's a bit hit and miss sometimes, especially if your horizon's not dead straight. But that's a kind of filter that you would use for a lot of photography where you've got a sky that is too bright, much brighter than the landscape. Well, what about daytime photography? I've already talked about daytime photography and light levels are low, when you don't need too much by way of filtration other than perhaps these ND grad filters. These ND grad filters will, of course, sort of increase the exposure time to a certain extent, but not by a massive amount. But in bright daylight, you need something much stronger, and then you're going to use something like this, a neutral density filter or ND filter. No grad, it's just ND or neutral density right the way across. And for this, you can use a circular one, or you can use a square one. This you can see is a circular one, of course, ND all the way across. And you can get them in different grades of darkness. So you can have different sets if you like. And of course, you need to have, if you've got a circular one, you've got to have the right thread for the front of your lens or lenses. So you may end up having to have several just in order to get different thread sizes. And if you've got different grades and you've got different several different filters of different grades, so it's all a bit of a mess. You can be a little bit better off if you're buying a circular and getting one of these, which is a variable ND grad filter. You have this rotating ring which changes the amount of darkness on the filter. And these white dots here show where you got the different settings for different amounts of neutral density filtering. And this is the maximum on this filter is an ND32, which means a 32-fold reduction in the amount of light going through, which is the same as saying a 5-stop reduction. A stop being a halving or doubling of the amount of light passing through. So ND32 is 5 stops. So you go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It's 5 stops. So that's the use of a circular one, and say to avoid having to have too many different filters in your bag if you're going down this route, have a variable filter that works really quite well. Or you can say you can have a square ND filter, and again these come in different grades. And they have the advantage of fitting into the same holder as your ND grad filters do. So they can work together with the ND grads if you want them to. And they use, as I say, use the same holder and the same adapter ring. And they say they come in various grads right up to what are called stoppers, which is what this is. There's a big stopper, which is a 10 stop reduction in the amount of light going through. 10 stops is a 1028-fold reduction in the amount of light going through. And then there's a little stopper, which is a 6 stop reduction in the amount of light going through, or 64-fold reduction in the amount of light going through. So a little bit stronger than that circular filter I just showed you. And because these stoppers do reduce the amount of light passing through quite significantly, on the back of them, they have this foam backing. So when you put them in the holder, that this foam must be pressed up against the filter holder, so that to cut out the risk of any light leaking around the sides. Obviously, when you're cutting out this much light passing through, any light that leaks around the edges and gets into the lens is going to have a fairly catastrophic effect on your pictures. It's going to be really noticeable. So that's sort of a characteristic feature of this ND filter and this ND stopper filter. Weaker ND filters, square ND filters, don't necessarily have this foam, but the stoppers certainly do. Obviously, it's not a problem with the circular filters because they screw onto the front of the lens, and there's no way for light to leak around the side of them. So here we are. I have a small stopper attached to the front of my camera using this filter holder. And I say you can combine this with an ND grad. So here we have the stopper filter on the back with the ND grad on the front of the holder. And if you look at it from behind, you can see the ND filter mounted on the holder here with that foam there pressing up against the holder, and the ND grad mounted in front. Now, it has to be that way around it to ensure that the foam is pressing up against the holder. Now, as you can imagine, with such dense filters, the problem you have is that when you put this on the camera, you can't see a darn thing through the viewfinder, through the eyepiece, or through the LCD screen, whichever way you're doing it. So you really have to set the image up, composition and everything, without this filter in, and that includes having the ND grad filter in place. So once you've got everything set up and sorted out, you then very carefully slide the ND filter in place without touching anything, without touching the ND grad, without touching the focus, or without touching the zoom ring if you're using a zoom lens, just sliding in very, very carefully and then taking the shot. The in-camera exposure meter should read the exposure reasonably well, even through a very dense stopper filter. Sometimes it doesn't get it quite right, and I do sometimes find that I do have to overexpose the image somewhat, perhaps up to a stop, in order to get the right exposure, but usually it does it reasonably well. All right, so that's the filters explained. Now we're going to go on to some examples where we use a stopper filter for ND photography in the middle of bright daylight. Now, so this is a very boring picture of the M5 at junction 29, just outside Exeter. And I've taken this. This is purely a sort of a demonstration exercise. This picture is obviously never going to win any prizes for anything. Just to show you the effect of filtration. So this picture is taken with sort of a 100mm lens or thereabouts, I think it was, with a fast shutter speed at 250th of a second at f/5, ISO 100. So the lens aperture is quite wide open. In order to give me quite a fast shutter speed, you see here that 250th of a second has been quite fast enough to breeze the movement of the traffic. And then really it looks quite boring. The traffic looks like it's all just completely stationary, and the whole image has lost any sense of movement. It's quite static. So how about trying to add a little bit of blur to actually give us the sense of movement? Well, there we have exactly the same thing, except using the slowest shutter speed I can get away with in the light that's delivered. And at this time of day, sort of lunchtime on a sort of a fairly bright day, not completely sunny, but this time of day it was 13th of a second at f/22. So I've got the lens aperture closed down as far as it will go on this lens. And all I can get down to is a 13th of a second, which is not fast enough, really. Sorry, not slow enough, really, to get a decent blur. You can see the traffic is blurred, but it's not a very interesting blur. it looks like I just couldn't really control the shutter speed very well and couldn't get it quite right. So let's put a stopper, that's a 6-stop stopper onto the front of the lens and see what happens. Boom, where's everything gone? Everybody's disappeared. You've got a few blurred lines here and there showing where there should be vehicles, but all the traffic's completely disappeared. There's a few down here as well. So this is 5 seconds. This is what happens at 5 seconds when you're photographing traffic that's moving at about 60 or 70 miles an hour. This is the F-22 again, and it all just completely disappears. Obviously, this is just really too much blur now. It's gone too far the other way, but it shows sort of what's possible and the extremes of what you can do if you really want to. So in the middle of the day, without the filter, you really can't get slow enough shutter speed to get a decent blur on the traffic to actually blur the movement. Put a stopper on, and you can get an enormous amount of blur, perhaps way too much. And if I wanted to make the shutter speed faster so that I wouldn't get so much blur, perhaps decrease it to 2 seconds maybe, then I could open up the lens aperture to f11, something like that, to 2 stops of f11, and then that would give me a shorter exposure time, and then I would get a blur which is more meaningful and would show the individual vehicles passing through here, but with a nice blur that puts over the sense of movement. Unfortunately, I didn't think about doing that shot on the day, so you'll just have to believe me. But you can go out and do experiments too if you've got these such filters, and see what you can achieve with different exposure times, different lens apertures to actually get different degrees of blur. Okay, so now I'm just going to give you a few examples of images taken during the day using a stopper filter. This is a shot on a sunny day on the south coast of Iceland. Fairly rare occurrence, I have to say. This is a 40th of a second, F22 ISO 100. So you can see the waves are pretty sharp. So they're not moving all that fast. The 40th of a second is not a particularly fast shutter speed, but nevertheless, it's been fast enough to freeze the movement of these waves. So it's an attractive enough kind of shot. But I just wonder what you could achieve what kind of picture you might get if you were to blur this exposure. Well, obviously, if I'm already down at f22, I'm not going to be able to get a shutter speed slower than a 40th of a second in order to blur that with moving water. So I'll have to put the stopper filter on the front of the lens. And when I do that, I end up with this, a 2-second exposure, f22. And you can see it's quite a different kind of picture. The waves are really blurred out. You can still see that there are waves there. It's 2 seconds. It's not that long an exposure time. And the waves are really quite blurred out, but nevertheless still quite visible. To go to 10 seconds, it would be quite difficult in the middle of this bright sunny day. I would have probably needed a 10-stop stopper to actually really completely blur this water out. But as it is, it's giving me a sense of energy and movement and dynamism. So it's an interesting shot, a very different kind of atmosphere from the previous sort of picture. We'll move on slightly to something else, close up of a waterfall. And I can see here that I've used a very fast shutter speed to freeze the movement of the water as it cascades down this waterfall. So you can see the droplets have been frozen. It's a little bit busy and complicated, but nevertheless, you can see that the water droplets are frozen in midair. So it's quite effective in many ways. This is actually a 4,000th of a second. So I really had to use a very fast shutter speed in order to blur that. And that's f5.6. And that's at ISO 320. So I put up the ISO up a bit in order to get fast enough shutter speed. This is on a bright sunny day, so even on this bright sunny day, still to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze and move to the water, I still had to put the ISO up a bit. But any shutter speed slower than this, I wouldn't have got the complete freezing of the water. These droplets wouldn't have been quite so static. They would have been a little bit blurred. So 4,000th of a second at 320 ISO, as I say, lens aperture is 5.6, which means the lens aperture is quite wide open, so the depth of field is quite poor. You see here the picture is getting blurred, and over here on the other side of the view, the picture's blurring out as well. So depth of field is fairly small, but it's sharp in the middle of the shot, that's for sure, giving us a good view of the water as it flies down the waterfall. Compare that with this image. You see much more clearly in this shot that it's a very sunny day. Not quite the same frame, obviously, as the previous image, because we can see much more of the rock in this shot. But you can see the water is completely blurred out now. We've got a really good sort of sense of dynamism and energy and movement in this water. No droplets frozen, of course. Everything's just blurred out into this silken sheet. And this is 1.6 seconds. So not a particularly long exposure time, but because the water is moving so darn fast, even in this relatively small waterfall, we're getting quite a significant blur. This is at f22 and ISO at 100. But f22, so we've got maximum, or the lens aperture is as small as I can get it. So we've got a big depth of field. Everything is sharp from right here, these rocks in the foreground, all the way to the rocks in the background. So a good, nice, sharp image all the way across. Apart from, of course, where the water is deliberately blurred, we've got this nice silken sheet of the water, 1.6 second exposure. And this, as I say, is with these six stopper filter. All right, so now I'm going to just show you, to finish off with a few general shots showing just some examples of images taken with ND filters, not necessarily the 6-stop, but ND filters anyway, sometimes with that round 32 and 5-stop filter, 32 filter. So taken in at dusk, just after sunset. So of course, light levels are quite low. Still, nevertheless, I've used ND grad certainly, but also actually, no, yes, there is an ND filter. This ND filter and an ND grad, just to lengthen the exposure time at 15 seconds at upon 18. So the water, 15 seconds is quite a long exposure time. So of course, so the water is completely blurred out. We've got lots of waves, not big waves, but waves coming up onto the shore, and they've almost completely disappeared. Right on the water's edge, you do have a little bit of the sense of moving water and a few waves there, but basically the water is blurred out to this very even and atmospheric sort of sheet. The next sort of shot, we've got bigger waves, and some more movements. But again, the waves are nevertheless blurred out completely into this sort of sheet, but it's not quite such a silken sheet. It's a little bit more varied, you might say. And this again is 15 seconds taken just after sunset. Actually, it might be just before sunset. I think it's just after sunset. So there's quite a lot of light present still. The sun is setting just behind this cliff. So that's where most of the light is, but there's still a lot of light here. So 15 seconds with an ND filter and an ND grad as well. The ND grad, the transition zone, or the horizon, you might say, of the ND's grad goes right the way across here and cuts across this cliff as well, so making the cliff a bit darker as well as the sky. For 15 seconds, f upon 10 as well, to actually not have the exposure time too long, but sort of opened up the exposure, the lens aperture a little bit to actually keep the exposure time manageable, but long enough nevertheless to completely blur out the waves of the Atlantic here. This is shows Longship's Lighthouse, just off Land's End, taken from Sannon Cove, just to the north of Land's End. And you really see, you don't see the waves anymore. Say whether this is a good thing or not, I don't know, but it's a very different atmospheric shot from one where you were, if you were able to get a fast shutter speed to actually freeze the movement of the waves. It's a very different atmosphere from the kind of image there. And then another shot actually looking straight into the sun. So again, just before it sets. So it's the evening, but there's still a lot of light around. And so we use an ND grad filter to darken the sky and an ND filter to darken everything to lengthen the exposure time. So 8 seconds at f upon 18. And just to really, ND filter to lengthen that exposure time up to 8 seconds. Make sure we get a nice blur on the water. It's still got a sense of the waves. It's not completely blurred out, but it's nicely atmospheric and nice atmospheric and moody. So again, you can see this is the same sort of location, Burr Island on the south coast of Devon, looking straight into the very bright sun. I say ND grad filter to darken that sky and really make it look, make it much more atmospheric, I suppose, and make obviously the contrast range between the sky and the water and the rock a little bit more manageable. And then almost there, a shot taken in the middle of the day. So 1.3 seconds, it's close up, f22 with an ND filter on to slow the exposure down a little bit. So say 1.3 seconds, the water is waves swirling around these rocks. The water is moving pretty fast, so we haven't had to use too long exposure time to really blur the moving water, blur out the moving water. But you can see this, there's still enough visible there to actually for you to see the movement of the wave as it swirls around the rock. It hasn't completely blurred out. You can still see the movement of the wave there, which I think is really quite nice. It gives you a real strong sense of energy and movement. Had I been able to slow the exposure still further, then this would have gone completely plain silky sheet, which would have been a very different kind of image and may or may not have worked. And then finally, in this shot, this is a really bright sunny day, very strong sunlight, and it's taken camera on a tripod actually. I've got one, of course, because we blurred the moving water, and it's f/22. You really shut the lens aperture down massively in order to minimize the amount of light coming through, and then using a 6-stop stopper so that we managed to get the exposure time down to 4 seconds. Without the stopper at f/22, the exposure time would have been about 60th of a second, I believe. So yeah, so down to 4 seconds is actually quite a big jump to get the exposure down, lengthening the exposure to get this water blurred, so you can really get the sense of energy and movement in this water and really feel the Atlantic waves swishing through this cove here on the north coast of Cornwall. So that, I hope, gives a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the use of filters and the techniques in long exposure photography with and without filters, I suppose I should say. And that's kind of it really, other than my usual thing at the end here, is a rather different picture from normal, the reason for which will become apparent in just a moment. Just want to finish off just with the usual sort of summary. I mean, just let you know, there's just one place left on my Wild West Cornwall photography tour, 3rd to 8th of November. So if anybody wants to come along, there's one space left. So please get in touch with me ASAP if you'd like to come. We're just in the process of booking the hotels at the moment. So if you could let me know if you're interested, that would be great. And then workshops, there are 2 more workshops remaining this year, 19th of October, which is Exmoor, and then 26th of October, which is Dartmoor. The workshops that have happened so far this month, the pictures from those will go on to the website soon. I'll be out in the next newsletter, I guess. And then, as you've probably seen in the newsletter, there's a new edition of Beautiful Cornwall out, my photographic book about Cornwall. And anybody who buys a copy of the new edition of Beautiful Cornwall also, whether they like it or not, get a free edition of the first edition, free copy of the first edition. And that's until stocks run out. We're almost out of the first edition now, but we've got a few copies left, and we'd quite like to get rid of them. Don't want them cluttering up our shelves for too much longer. So if you want to have two copies of Beautiful Cornwall first edition and second edition, then they're there. And then next January we'll see the 35th anniversary of me becoming a professional photographer, which I can't believe it's so many years already. So the next talk will be in January. I know that on the website it says it's going to be in December, and that's when it would normally be, but it's actually going to be in January. And that talk will be kind of a retrospective of my career, and that's where this photo on the left comes in. That shows me a tender age of, taken 29 years ago. So I don't think I want to do the maths really about what my age was, but early in the 30s anyway, standing on the roof of the Jokhang Temple, which is the sort of the center of Tibetan Buddhism. This is in Lhasa, capital of Tibet, with the Potala Palace in the background. So this was me photographing for a book about the wildlife and so on of China all those years ago. Commissioned by a publisher in London. So that talk, I say that'll be a retrospective about my career, and that talk will actually be the last in this current program of regular talks. On everything runs its course, I suppose. There will still be talks in the future, but they'll be irregular. It'll be when I come up when I think of something really good to talk about, or if you guys suggest something that you really like to hear me talk about, that's another subject another reason it would make me launch a talk. So there will be talks next year, but sort of fairly irregular and on an ad hoc basis, and they will be announced well in advance, and they will continue to be free to attend. Will continue just to need to register to get the link. All the talks have been held over the last 4 years. I can't remember been doing this program for 4 years, since COVID in 2020. Will stay on the website, so they're there for anybody to reference at any time. So that really is it. If you have any questions, I'll unshare my screen. If you have any questions, please ask away. Obviously, you need to turn your microphone on to ask a question. If you want to turn your camera on as well, feel free. But of course, you'll then be visible to go on will go in a recording that will go onto YouTube in the next week or so. So I'm unsharing the screen now. Hopefully, if I can. I've stopped sharing. There we go. That's it. That's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so there we go. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Went pretty darn fast. Anybody got any questions? David, you're up on the screen. You got a question there?
Yeah, one occurs to me at the moment. Is it safe to assume that for all the settings that you've given us with your various exposure settings and so on and so forth, was the camera set on manual?
No, not really. No, usually on that aperture priority because the camera will be on the tripod, and that's the way I usually shoot when the camera's on the tripod. So I would have been shooting on aperture priority.
Okay.
It would only go on to manual. The way I work, it would only go on to manual if the exposure time was more than 30 seconds, and then I would go to manual. Then I could use bulb, but usually I just go straight to manual. Which does happen occasionally. Yeah, sometimes obviously if there's a night sky photography, exposure time is often more than 30 seconds. Anybody else?
Hi, it's Laurie.
Hi, Laurie.
Hi. Yeah, just one thought. I played with a big stopper some years back, actually, when they first became sort of fashionable.
Yeah.
And I remember people saying about, you lose all visibility on the screen when you're doing that work. But my camera happened to have electronic viewfinder.
Okay.
And I don't remember seeing that, you see.
Actually, it's quite possible that an electronic viewfinder, LCD screen, whatever, would actually overcome that. It depends. Yeah, because I don't use it. I'm old-fashioned, I suppose. I use the optical
viewfinder.
Yeah. And actually, I have switched over to the LCD screen once or twice, and yeah, it's still been dark on my camera. It's still been dark. I think perhaps that varies from one camera make to another. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, so I hope I'm right, but I'm not going to be positive about it because some time ago.
Yeah, we'll try it again and see what happens.
Yeah, I will.
I generally find the 10 stopper to be a bit of overkill most of the time, but there have been a few instances where I thought to myself, yeah, the 10 stopper would actually have been a little bit more effective with this image.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, all right. Anybody else? Okay, so if nobody else wants to ask any questions, no, you're all done, then I'll bring the talk to an end, and I'll see you either in October if you come on one of the workshops, or in November if you decide to come on the Cornwall tour, or online in January. The details of the online of the next online talk in January will be up on the website soon, and will probably be in the next newsletter in October as well. So we'll talk again and see you again soon. Thanks very much for coming along this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. That was great.
Welcome.
Thank you, Nigel.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye.